And we know that with global population expected to reach 9 billion by 2050, we're going to see even greater competition for lands in terms of agricultural use for food production. And we know that agriculture is a major driver of environmental change for the urban populace and also for the protection of our natural environment, such as forests. And on top of all of these competing land use tensions, the climate change is expected to worsen all of the competition. And this is especially urgent to address in Hawaii because we have over 87% of our food is imported in Hawaii, but at the same time, 41% of our agricultural lands are unfarmed and are just fallow. And a lot of these agricultural lands are actually filled with invasive species. And these invasive species serve to further put pressure on our already threatened native ecosystems. We have some of the highest rates of endemism in the world, but 40% of our native Hawaiian plants are either listed as threatened or endangered, and probably more now with the new IUCN measures. And related to the dire situation on land, the indigenous people of Hawaii, Kanaka Maoli, have been under colonialism and displaced from a lot of their traditional lands and ancestral lands that they stewarded for almost a millennia. And under these pressures today, as a result, they face massive socioeconomic inequalities. And in Hawaii, we are already seeing the effects of climate change, which we can expect to affect both our agricultural systems and our native ecosystems, because of fluctuations in rainfall as well as rising temperatures. And increases in storm frequencies are also expected to affect how agricultural products and inputs and our food is imported into the islands. So clearly, management alternatives that can reconcile agricultural production with the maintenance and enhancement of biodiversity, especially in these human-dominated landscapes, are critical now and into the future. So more recently, because of this, there has been more attention given to food production systems that are designed with ecological principles and traditional knowledge. And there's more interest in how indigenous people manage their food worldwide. And this is because these landscapes are community managed and traditionally managed landscapes. Food production landscapes are widespread around the globe. They can have sustained yields and meet the subsistence needs of really high populations. And usually this is out without any external inputs. And they can serve to balance environmental and social outcomes. So why, as conservation scientists, should we care about indigenous agroecosystems? Some indigenous agroecosystems have been shown to be demonstrated systems of resilience, meaning that they can bounce back and resist disturbances and maintain their function throughout disturbances. And this is often because they're diverse at the farm and landscape level, so usually integrating many species, many varieties of crops, and then they often mimic natural systems such as this agroforestry system looking really like a forest. And often indigenous agroecosystems include forest patches that are protected next to farm plots. And some indigenous agricultural systems have been shown to preserve biodiversity outside of formerly protected areas. And that's really important in Hawaii, where over half of our lands are not zoned conservation, and 47% of our lands are actually zoned agriculture. So this is a huge opportunity to look at these human-dominated landscapes as a way, and the restoration of these systems in those places as a way to preserve biodiversity and increase local food production. So beyond biodiversity conservation, why is indigenous agriculture important? Of course, we know for many indigenous people around the world, connections to food systems go beyond cultivation alone. They really extend into kinship. And in Hawaii, that is evident in a Kanaka Maoli relationship to our older brother, Haloa Nakalau Kapalili, and in one cosmology was the firstborn and stillborn of Wakea and Ho'ohokukalani. And the N ended up being the elder brother to feed us for generations to come. And today, people still regard Haloa in that way. And because of these deep cultural ties, such as our relationship to Haloa, there is large interest in restoring Hawaiian agricultural systems today. And that's evident in the clothes we wear, poi for breakfast, radical Hawaiian taoist. I'm sure all of you have a shirt with kalo on it. And so there's also interest in these programs, and they've been coming up more recently, is Aina-based education programs, where it provides opportunities for people to connect with traditional systems again. And really, there's opportunity to restore these systems in Hawaii because they are proven, they were sustainable for a long term, and they were specifically adapted to Hawaii. But what's more is that they were able to exist along with very high levels of biodiversity. So these systems sound amazing and have so many benefits, but the challenge is that indigenous agriculture is often overlooked in academia and policy, and because of such vast social and environmental changes, the potential of these systems today is unknown. And there are often common criticisms such as it doesn't produce or no one wants to do it. But however, no one's really looked at that. There's a lack of studies looking at their combined social and environmental viability. So that's what my project kind of focuses, filling these gaps. The overall aim is to understand the past, present, and future potential of indigenous Hawaiian agricultural systems in order to inform their restoration today. And like I mentioned, we integrated a bunch of disciplines. So I use a combination of methods that I'm going to talk about, and I can't go into depth with all of them today, but we use archival research into primary Hawaiian language and English language records, spatial distribution modeling, including climate change modeling, vegetation soil surveys, ecosystem functioning modeling, economic modeling, and I also facilitated workshops and interviews to really try to address this huge and broad topic. So the three main study objectives that correlate to the three chapters I'm going to be talking about today is first, I want to determine the potential of indigenous Hawaiian agriculture in the past, present, and into the future. Second, I want to investigate whether and in what ways these systems can be competitive in today's social, ecological, and political system. And third, I want to identify approaches that can be taken to effectively restore these systems today. And when I talk about restoration of indigenous agroecosystems or Kanaka Maoli agriculture, I'm talking about a system that integrates plant species and integrates native plant species. And this is a huge focus of my dissertation because of all of the biodiversity threats I talked about earlier in Hawaii. And these systems are not static like culture. They evolved over time and integrated new species as they came, such as this kupuna mango tree in a quote-unquote traditional dryland Hawaiian agricultural system in Kona. And when I talk about restoration of these systems, I'm not talking about simply recreating the past, but I'm talking about drawing upon the knowledge, the values, and the principles, and the cultural connections related to traditional agricultural practices to develop systems that are appropriate in today's social and environmental context. So the first chapter I'm going to go into. Are you guys ready? Okay. Gotta keep it like fun. We're going to explore the past, present, and future potential of these systems in Hawaii today. So, like I mentioned, Kanaka Maoli under colonization have been systematically disconnected from their ancestral lands, from food and associated practices. And so because of this, there are relatively few functioning indigenous agroecosystems today. And of course, there are resilient kipukas of indigenous agroecosystems across the entire Pai'aina, but by and large, compared to traditional times, there's really not as many. And because of this, the spatial extent and future potential of these lands is not well understood. So we're not completely sure where they all are, and because the landscape has transformed so much over time. So the research questions within this chapter is first, where did traditional agricultural systems exist in Hawaii? Second, what is the productive capacity of these agricultural lands? And third, what is the future potential of these lands given in the context of land use and climate changes? So I developed species distribution models for three main agricultural systems in Hawaii. And I'm going to be explaining them slide by slide. And these are based on the ecological niche that these systems can exist. So first, and probably the most well-known system in Hawaii is lo'i, or pond-field agriculture. And of course, lo'i is based upon kalo. And even though it is based upon kalo, there was other species integrated on the banks of lo'i, and native species could indeed be grown alongside on the banks of these systems today. And so we looked at different parameters. So when I show you the next ones, all the parameters will be at the bottom that were used in the model, such as distance from streams. We looked at soils, determined what slope and elevation lo'i could occur at, and then when you intersect all of those layers in the magical world of R and GIS, you get a model of where these systems could exist based on these environmental and climatic parameters. So next, I'm going to be talking about the rain-fed dryland agriculture, which is the second major system in Hawaii. And of course, this system was based upon uala, but is much more heterogeneous than lo'i, because it really kind of works within the microclimates that it's grown. So across the landscape, you could have different tree species integrated, as well as natives, and other crops as well. And the parameters we used are below. And then the third system that we identified and modeled was agroforestry system. And so this is a multi-crop system that integrates many different species, including tree species, mid-story species, and root and tuber crops and ground cover species as well. And these systems had many perennial species, and so were less intensive than the other two I mentioned earlier. And so I am the first to build and parameterize this model, to parameterize a model to identify agroforestry, areas that could support agroforestry in Hawaii. And so I want to show you the results of all three of those models across the Pai'aina. And so this is showing the areas that could support those three systems pre-colonization. And the model identified over 250,000 acres. And so we checked the model with archaeological and ethnohistoric evidence. And I don't have time to go into that, but we can talk about different places. And it matched up pretty well. And then we can look at how many acres each system produced, take into account fallow, yield, and we can estimate how much food was being produced annually. And this is interesting because the models are showing that on this 250,000 acres, Hawaiian Kanaka Maoli were likely could have produced over 1 million metric tons of food per year. And this is interesting because this is comparable to the amount of food that we're consuming in Hawaii today. And when you look at the breakdown of the modeled system and present-day agriculture, you can see that we have much more land in agricultural production, and that includes cropland and pasture. But of course, we're producing much less food locally and importing the rest. And because Hawaii has commitments to more than double local food production by 2020, and our models show that clearly a lot of food can be produced on Kanaka Maoli traditional agricultural lands. And even if some of the lands was put towards this type of production, which has ecological benefits, health benefits, and cultural benefits, it could really contribute to Hawaii's goals of food self-sufficiency. And what's more is that a lot of the lands identified by the model are not necessarily lands that are good for vegetable production or other major crops in Hawaii. So it wouldn't be competing with a lot of our major locally produced foods. And it really could be a complementary system, given that so much of our lands, our agricultural lands, are currently fallow. Okay, so then we can take the production numbers I just showed you, and we can estimate based upon a 3,000 calorie a day diet, which is a conservative estimate. We can estimate from that how many people could have been fed from this amount of production. So we're estimating that theoretical carrying capacity is about 1.2 million people on just using 6% of Hawaii's land. And this is really interesting. Oh, and this estimate, of course, is not taking into account the protein from land and sea. And these results are interesting because there's no consensus on the pre-contact Hawaiian population, and the estimates are ranging in values. But our study uses new methods to show that there could have been enough food produced to support a high-end population estimate by David Stannard of 800,000. And this also supports his idea that the depopulation of Kanaka Maoli after the introduction of Western diseases was likely on the order of 90%, similar to the decimation experienced by other indigenous people in the Americas. Okay, so we know that these systems were extremely productive traditionally, but what is their potential today, given that Hawaii is one of the most developed islands, it's one of the most developed set of islands in the Pacific? So I took the model, and so on the x-axis, or on the y-axis we have acres, and on the x-axis we have the three systems, lo'i, dryland, agroforestry, and combined on Oahu and on all islands. And then in the bars, the colors represent the current land use. Black is developed, and then the rest are color-coded. Agriculture is the bottom. So that's the agriculture zone. So what we showed is that I really thought, or we thought that because so many agricultural lands have been converted from agriculture into development in the past few decades in Hawaii, that development would have reduced these lands by a lot. But surprisingly, it only slightly reduces the acreage and production potential of these Kanaka Maoli agricultural lands. And 75% in this bar of the potential lands identified by the model are actually zoned agriculture today. And this is important because those are, especially the ones that are fallow, are ones that we can direct as restoration and management right now. They're zoned agriculture. This is agriculture. But just because they're zoned agriculture doesn't mean that they're not under pressure from development. And you can see by this figure that agriculture zone land has been reduced by 29,000 acres statewide since 1969. And just to put that in perspective, 29,000 acres is about 12% of all the modeled agricultural land that I showed in the three systems. So really, the takeaway from this is that the protection of all agricultural lands must be a priority, especially around urban centers, which it was, urban center around Oahu was much more under pressure by development. And so the protection of all agricultural lands must be a priority, and we need to balance the requirements for urban growth, especially around urban centers, with the demands of food self-sufficiency. Okay, so what about climate change? So given that Hawaii has a plan to increase food self-sufficiency, we really need to understand how climate change is going to affect both the spatial extent and production of all agriculture in Hawaii today. But to date, no one has really looked at this. There's one study in Hawaii that looks at the climate change shifts of any agriculture, and that's coffee systems and mac-nut systems on one island. So here, in this study, we are modeling all three lo'i, dryland, and agroforestry systems under three different climate change scenarios downscaled for Hawaii. So 1 A1B, 2 RCP 4.5, and 3 RCP 8.5. So A1B is just projecting a little bit wetter overall, and RCP 4.5 is dry, and RCP 8.5 is drier, just the short synopsis. So, okay, so this graph, like the one you just saw, has the systems on the bottom, and then we have the current model, the A1B model, RCP 4.5, and RCP 8.5 model. Does that make sense? And then within the bars, the colors represent what what zone, what the land use is today. So what we're showing, or what I'm showing, is that there are the drier scenarios are showing large losses in agroforestry and, or not large, but somewhat large losses of agroforestry lands and dryland lands. And this amounts to about, one scenario showed an increase in production, and while the other scenario showed decreases up to 17%. And a major result of this is that even under drier climate change scenarios, the majority of all the lands are still zoned agriculture under each of these three agricultural systems. However, under the drier scenarios, conservation may become increasingly important over time. And this is interesting because in some conservation areas that may be dominated by invasive species, agroecosystem restoration could be a way to finance forest restoration by planting viable crops with native species and providing access for communities as well in these places. And so this could really help to both restore native biodiversity in these areas and produce food in a changing climate. And so spatially, we have all 4 scenarios, current and the 3 climate change scenarios on a map. And when you intersect them all, this is the resulting map. And so what this map is saying is these are the areas that may be the most resilient to a range of climate changes. And so with that intersection, about half of all the current areas was identified. And this map could be used by management, by policy, as areas we can target for restoration today, and that will likely be resilient into the future. Okay, so that was a lot of information. So I'm going to summarize the results for you just quickly. So Hawaii could have sustained over 250,000 acres of traditional agroecosystems. These lands produced a comparable amount of food to what Hawaii consumes today, and that supports hypotheses of high pre-contact populations. Third, we showed development has slightly reduced traditional lands, but that most non-developed lands are currently still zoned agriculture. And our climate change results indicate that large areas will still be viable under a range of climatic changes. So we know theoretically there's a lot of potential, but practically what are the costs and benefits of indigenous agroecosystem restoration compared to competing land uses today? Indigenous agriculture is often disregarded as irrelevant in current global economic and cultural structures. People often say that it's too expensive or too intensive or too expensive relative to other conventional land use practices. But despite all these criticisms, there are really no empirical estimates looking at their combined social and environmental viability. But there's this new tool called ecosystem service assessments that emerged as a way to look at how different land uses could affect different social and environmental outcomes. So an example of ecosystem services they're shown here, can be a good such as food. It could be regulating services like erosion regulation, cultural services, we have education and inspiration, or supporting services like nutrient cycling or soil retention. And so this really provides a way to look at multiple outcomes in these range of categories over different land uses. So I just wanted to show an example of an assessment. So this is from a study in Hawaii, and it's showing water quality, carbon storage, and financial returns under different various land use changes in the same area, so that you can get an idea of how best to make decisions based on all of those outcomes together. So even though this is a great tool to look at how these land uses would affect or how indigenous agriculture might affect these different ecosystem services, there's a gap in assessments that look specifically at indigenous agriculture. And few assessments in general actually combine multiple disciplines together, like that one I showed of carbon, water, and financial. And across ecosystem services literature, many cultural ecosystem services are basically ignored, and if they are considered, they're often considered in terms of recreation or tourism. And like I talked about with indigenous agriculture, people's relationships to those systems run much deeper than an analysis of tourism could convey. So what I did, Tamara said I can't say we. Okay, so what I did is I looked at a potential agroforestry, a potential Hawaiian agroforestry system, and I wanted to know what are the potential outcomes of agroforestry restoration in terms of 1, conservation value, 2, groundwater recharge, 3, carbon sequestration, 4, food production, 5, economic returns, and 6, cultural benefits. And I wanted to see how these measures compared with other major land uses, secondary forest, which is currently in the project area, and coffee, which both these land uses are widespread in Kona, in the region, and in Hawaii and globally. And then I wanted to discuss what are the trade-offs of services and implications for indigenous agroecosystem restoration. So the potential agroforestry scenario that I'm going to talk about is a restoration project on a 345-acre parcel in Kahului, in the Kona Kaiopua region on Hawaii Island. And this is where we are facilitating on-the-ground indigenous agroforestry restoration with community, in collaboration with the landowner Kamehameha schools. And this area has been invaded, and a lot of it looks like this. And it's special because it is the largest intact remnant of a traditional system, the Kona field system. And however, so like I mentioned, it's pretty invaded, so we weren't really sure, though restoration is happening, and a lot of the measures the economic costs, and along with like the species that are being planted, were integrated into our hypothetical model. But this scenario is not mature yet, so we really had to design an agroforestry scenario. And in order to compare how agroforestry would differ from coffee, would differ from secondary forests, we really had to make a spatially explicit comparison and a spatially explicit map for each scenario in the same place. So first, we had to take the project area, and I did a remote sensing analysis to figure out what's the major canopy vegetation there now. So I found that half of the project area in green is ohia, the native ohia, and the other half is covered in strawberry, guava, and Christmas berry invasives. And so under the coffee scenario, we assume that all the invasives are taken out and the ohia stays, and coffee is planted in the shade under the ohia as well as the sun setting where the invasives are removed. And then in the agroforestry scenario, we assume that the ohia stays and the invasives are removed, and that a mix of crops and native plants are planted there, under the ohia and outside. And like I mentioned, because we don't really know exactly what a mature agroforestry system would look like, or what species would be involved, I designed this scenario. And this was based upon the ecological viability of these species, if it was previously mentioned as planted in the area, if it was, these species were located in the adjacent forests, and if they're being used in restoration today. So it's a huge list, but I just wanted to highlight that we do have many, we are integrating many endemic indigenous species alongside Polynesian introductions and other introductions. And then we determine what % cover they would have in both the overstory, which is the yellow side, and the understory, which is the blue side. So we can get back to that later, but just wanted to show you how I did it. Okay, and so to look at these different measures, I'm going to just quickly tell you how I did looked at each ecosystem benefit. It's going to be fast. Okay. So to look at conservation value, I did a vegetation survey looking at species richness, density, ground cover, ohia density, soil fertility, and the agroforestry scenario, we estimated those measures and explained how we did that in the last slide. In terms, to figure out what the differences under each land cover would be in terms of ground cover, we created actual evapotranspiration models based upon annual climate and vegetation predictor values for each land cover. And then we looked at carbon sequestration and included measures of above ground, litter, below ground, and soil carbon. And for the above ground carbon in the secondary forest, we actually measured DBH across the site in different vegetation types. And for coffee, we measured the basal diameter to estimate above ground biomass in the coffee setting. And then for food production and economic returns, we estimated yields, monetary costs, and revenue for each crop. And in the agroforestry scenario, I included 9 crops plus, including koa restoration, and one category called forest restoration, which actually incurred costs but didn't generate any revenue. And for coffee, and we did a net present value of 5%. And in the agroforestry scenario, we accounted for volunteer labor cost savings as well. For the community value or community benefits, I facilitated a half-day community workshop in Hōʻuluʻulu and subsequent semi-structured interviews. And the participants at the workshop and the interviews were individuals with an in-depth relationship to Hōʻuluʻulu and the broader Kona area. So quickly, these are some of the results ecologically and economically for the 3 scenarios. So the first A is looking at, even though we looked at a lot of measures of ecological diversity, this graph is showing species richness in native and invasive species across each scenario. And so you can see secondary forest, we only found 3 native species across the site, ohia, palapalai, and hapu'u in our plots. And in coffee, ohia was present. And then in the agroforestry scenario, this bar is representing all of the just indigenous and endemic species, not Polynesian introductions. And the invasive cover, you can see, is extremely high in the secondary forest. In terms of water yield, agroforestry tended towards higher water yield than the 2 other land uses, but as actually only significantly different from coffee. So it's significantly more water yield than coffee. And that difference between agroforest and coffee actually amounts to enough water for about 600 people per year in domestic water use. Okay, in carbon, you can see that secondary forests had the highest estimated carbon storage. And this is mainly because of the high amount of biomass in the invasive forest types in strawberry guava and Christmas berry in the site. And I did a low of 25% and 75 percentile estimation for various agroforestries in Pacific or in tropical locations to get some of these measures. And you can see that even the low agroforestry estimate is still more carbon storage than what coffee could store, likely because it integrates more trees. And then you can see the revenue over 50 years in coffee and agroforestry. And agroforestry actually had just 10% of the net present value or the net revenue over the 50 years. And the way I designed agroforestry, it was appropriate for Hōʻuluʻulu. And there is flexibility in what crops you can include. And we weren't able to include 6 crops that we know are economically viable, but there just wasn't enough data to include them in the analysis. So really you can look at this as a potential minimum. Okay, so I just talked about those tangible benefits that one could, or that are resulting from those 3 different land uses. And now I'm going to talk about more of the intangible benefits that came out when talking to the community. So the workshop responses really highlighted, they really de-emphasized end land uses or agricultural products that drove the benefits, but really wanted to focus on the processes that helps them to maintain connections to Aina. And a lot of the responses focused around 3 main themes. One, ohana, and they talked about processes that enable them to connect to ohana ancestrally, such as working in areas that they know their kupuna worked in. And then they also talk about ohana in the future as future generations, and they talk about their direct ohana, but they also talk about their ohana in the community and the broader Kanaka Maoli community as making sure that they're passing things on for future generations. Second, a lot of people talked about the importance of laulima through collective, and laulima can be described as collective action or accomplishment, and people talked about short-term benefits of laulima as well as long-term benefits, which included social cohesion at family levels, across families, and across communities. And then a third theme that came out was identity that's stored within Aina, and I have a quote to kind of illustrate that one. But all of these benefits can be realized through restoration, and such as indigenous agroforestry restoration. So here's a quote from a volunteer from Keopu, Kona. Our people have been threatened by abuse, physical, mental, social, for generations. Our land has been abused, development, large-scale agriculture, pasture invasives, fire for generations. And we continue the cycle of abuse both on the land and to ourselves as people. We have a kuleana to restore these Hawaiian landscapes, not only to heal the land, but to heal our families and ultimately our communities. So you can see from this quote that there's really a shared identity with Aina that is genealogical, but really can be manifested in the health of our landscapes and the health of our people. And so a lot of the responses that are in this column fit into 4 broad categories, which were developed by Po'ala Pascual in her master's thesis. And they are ike, or knowledge, mana, spirituality, pili kanaka, social interactions, and olomau, physical and mental well-being. So what I did was I evaluated how each scenario would affect each of the responses that were mentioned. And while secondary forests, and this is only part of the table, but while secondary forests and coffee can provide some of the benefits that were expressed, agroforestry really facilitates opportunities for the most of these benefits to be realized. And this is something that might be expected, of course, and those of you who work within communities know that these are the benefits that people get from Aina-based education, from restoration. But no one has really looked at, no one has quantified these, and if we want to go to policy and make changes, this is how we, or it's important to have them organized and, yeah. It's important to quantify them and have them alongside all the other benefits that agroforestry can provide. So this spider diagram is showing each of the ecosystem services I talked about and their relative value against each other, against each of the 3 scenarios. So you can see that in green, agroforestry provides almost all the services of secondary forests in blue, plus much higher conservation value, food production, and cultural services that were almost non-existent in the secondary forest. And you can also see that relative to coffee, the economic returns were relatively low, but we also found that community labor could offset total costs in the first 5 years of restoration by 8 to 31%, and that's a huge amount. And that's important because, this agroforestry scenario is really tailored to kahalu'u and to our purposes for restoration, but I did include coffee within our agroforestry scenario, but just at 1.5 acres. So it was really like 1% of the entire project area. So if you were more concerned about economic value, you could up the acreage of crops you know are really economically viable and integrate the 2. So in summary of this chapter, indigenous agriculture restoration can really serve to substantially broaden the range of services that are provided by some of the most common land uses. We showed that engagement in restoration can promote cultural benefits through access, through providing opportunities for social cohesion and opportunities to fulfill kuleana to Aina, or responsibility to place. And we also showed that engagement in restoration can also reduce economic costs of restoration. And even though a lot of these cultural ecosystem services haven't been mentioned in the cultural ecosystem services literature, they are recognized in the indigenous food sovereignty movement, where restoration of indigenous food systems is an important contributor to autonomy, and I think that restoration projects themselves can be an important form of self-determination for indigenous people. And then finally, from our economic analysis, we showed that policies are needed. Oh, sorry, typo. Policies are needed to balance the environmental and social well-being with economic incentive. And that really affects both the local and broader communities. Okay, last chapter. Okay, so I talked about the production potential, the viability of indigenous agroecosystems ecologically, economically, and culturally, but what are approaches we can take today to effectively restore these systems? And so I call this chapter Ikawama Mua, which is, most of you probably know, it's the Hawaiian word for the past, and it literally means the time in front. And so you get a visual that a Hawaiian is standing firmly in the present and always looking to the past for answers for current and future problems. And this is an approach that we take in this chapter. So, like I said, humans have altered almost every inch of the landscape on Earth, and ecological restoration is basically becoming a conservation necessity, both locally and globally. And Kanaka Maoli and their ancestors are genealogically tied to all elements of our surroundings, and thus we are an inseparable part of every Hawaii landscape. So therefore, ecological restoration projects can benefit from a biocultural approach, integrating the cultural side into ecological restoration. And so when I say biocultural restoration, I'm talking about the mutually reinforcing restoration of land and culture such that the repair of ecosystem services contributes to cultural revitalization, and that the renewal of culture promotes ecological integrity. And so basically, reciprocally restoring ecological and cultural integrity over time. And given that the connections of Kanaka to Aina spans almost a millennia here, a social projects should take this approach. Yet projects often take a purely ecological approach to restoration, solely looking at biophysical research, targets, monitoring, and measures of success. And it could be because a social-cultural understanding of the ecosystem can seem inaccessible at times for those who aren't familiar with the sources that are there. A way to approach biocultural restoration is a historical ecology approach. And so historical ecology is a field that seeks to understand the interaction between people and landscapes over time to inform current management. And this isn't a new topic because we basically use parts of historical ecology approach in my first 2 chapters. And I want to talk about how easily this approach is especially applicable in Hawaii, given that some of the main principles are already embedded in the Kanaka Maoli worldview, like I talked about Ikawama Mua, Ikawama Hope. Much of the socio-ecological knowledge is stored within local communities, in documentary archives, in oral histories, and in anthropological studies. And knowledge of interactions between people and place and land is especially deep in Hawaii because of continued cultural practices such as subsistence fishing, and traditional knowledge which is stored in place names which are frequent across the Hawaiian landscape, and of course in mele and mo'olelo, which are still being told and transmitted within communities. And many of the documentary sources that I mentioned have already been gathered, and many are digitized and freely available. Oh, gotta hurry up. Okay, so in this chapter, I wanted to explore the advantages and potential outcomes of using a historical ecology approach in ecological restoration in Hawaii. So to do this, I draw upon a case study to outline historical ecology methods and available resources in Hawaii, and illustrate the benefits of integrating this approach into restoration and management of a biocultural landscape. And so again, I focus on kuahewa restoration in Kahalu'u, where we have goals to not only increase native conservation value, but enhance local food production and human community resilience. And even though this is a unique field site in that it's an agroecosystem with many cultural features, it's ecologically representative of many landscapes across Hawaii where the vegetation has gone from forest to agriculture, oftentimes to a new type of agriculture and back to forest again. So in our site, the degraded nature of the vegetation left almost no living evidence of the species that naturally occurred in the area, or that were cultivated historically alongside of these natives. So we had to employ a historical ecology approach to begin to identify species to utilize in our restoration. So, I want to say that, and we want this case study to be an example roadmap for those who might be unfamiliar with historical sources, and also a more complete resource for those who already take a historical ecology approach, as we know many community programs do. So these I looked at and compiled 19 sources, 14 which are freely available online, and this is just the beginning of my table. So we have the source, and so one of the sources we looked at was the Hawaiian newspaper articles, and they're freely available on Papakilo or at newpaper.org. I listed the language that the source is available in, some of the information we got out of it that is pertinent to restoration, the scale, and then the cost. And these are all of the resources we used looking at time scales, so temporal scale on the y-axis and spatial scale on the x-axis from farm to region level. And of course, a lot of these sources operate at different time scales, operate at different spatial scales, but the value is really bringing these all together to get the most complete picture of the site for your restoration purposes that you can. So I wanted to talk about some of the outcomes that we had in restoration and some of the applications of this approach in our restoration project. So we learned to first listen and go slowly. And I know this sounds simple, but really it was one of the most important outcomes for using the historical ecology approach, because we learned to understand the site as best we could before through these historical resources, before making any major decisions about clearing and restoration from a natural and cultural management perspective. These sources were used to generate a planting list for restoration, which I used in my previous chapter and I showed you. And actually 36 of the total 68 species were cited as previously existing in the project area from this historical ecology approach. And 8 of these were mentioned only by community members when talking to them through using this approach. So it also highlights the value of community participation within this approach. We established interpretive trails of sites and plants. We initiated Aina-based education programming. We restored a lot of the Kanaka Maoli terms, and those could be utilized for place names, for names of the water cycle. We hope to restore more Kanaka Maoli practices, and one of the biggest applications that came out of this is really the collective information through this approach serves as a form of reciprocity. And it's reciprocity from us who have the opportunity to manage the site to the site itself. And it's a form of reciprocity from us for information that we can share with whoever comes and participates in restoration. And really, I think that it's the most valuable part of the research is to truly engage people through history and through this place and through the information that we've found. And it really is a way to honor those who came before us and those who will come after us in Kuaheba and Kahalu'u. So in summary of this chapter, I pulled together a bunch of information to really provide a resource for conservation practitioners to use in restoration. And we showed that this approach is readily adoptable into the field of ecological restoration today in Hawaii. And that ecological restoration is becoming much more necessary across the country. And it's expensive, and there's not always enough resources to feed every restoration project. And studies have shown that public and community involvement in restoration really drives its success in the long term. And I want to make the point that this motivation in Hawaii is deep, and the drive to restore landscapes comes from a desire to return to ancestral lands, to learn a history of the place, and really learn yourself again. And so a lot of this drive is powerful, and it can be captured into restoration in Hawaii, and can be fostered through utilizing a historical ecology approach. And so it can really be a powerful tool to connect with the participants in restoration and to have a reciprocal relationship and to foster their own reciprocal relationship with those places. So I want to say that restoration and management can facilitate these connections by not only enabling physical access, but almost as importantly, through the sharing of the stories, the names, and the history of the place. And hopefully that using this approach could help the discipline advance beyond restoring ecosystems alone, but restoring the function of landscapes by recognizing and incorporating past and present relationships of people to those places. Okay, so I know I'm over time. Okay, this is the last one. So overall, I want to, oh, no, wait, visualization. Okay, so imagine all those places that are filled with one invasive species of strawberry guava or of Christmas berry. Now imagine a space that's full of food, of native species, and full of people and communities. I talked about the common criticism that it doesn't produce. We showed in our first chapter that it does. There's the common criticism that people aren't interested. We showed not only do they provide more ecosystem services than the common land uses, but that people are participating in the process of restoration because of benefits that span knowledge, spirituality, social interactions, and physical and mental well-being. And 3, we showed that the process of restoring indigenous agriculture can not only rebuild ecological communities, but can rebuild the human communities and the relationships between the two. And in the end, it's those connections that are ultimately the key of sustainability, both here in Hawaii and globally. So, mahalo palena ole, first and foremost to the Kahalu'u and Keoho community, and of course, my mentor and everybody else, you know who you are. Mahalo. I went too long.
We started 10 minutes late, so those of you who need to vote.
Oh, shit. No questions means bad. Oh.
Have you, so kind of in the first chapter, you had your models of the 3 different traditional agrosystems. Have you crossed those, like cross-referenced those maps with like zoning and like land ownership? I'm just wondering about how accessible some of those spaces are to actually being restored into traditional ag.
Yeah, I think I didn't do landowner, but it does come up a lot. Zoning, yeah, we did zoning, and that was shown in the development one. But eventually I also want to put these layers to be freely available on OHA's Kipuka website so that people can see ecologically where they live, what could grow, what could be a good mix of crops to grow where they're from. But that was one of the policy ideas, is get all the major landowners that these lands fall upon and talk about possible restoration ideas. Thanks, Linnea. Anybody else? Rachel? Okay.
About how you chose your site, or if it chose you, or if you chose that place because it had a wealth of information already about it, or not. If places you recommend historical ecology approach for more widespread restoration, and if there's not as much of a wealth of information, how you feel about that.
Yeah, I think I mentioned that in my chapter that some places have more information than others. And Kahalu'u had a pretty good amount of information, at least for a lot of it at the Makai area because it was a chiefly center. But I think that the point is that even if you could find one thing or 2 things, that you're really expanding your view of the site beyond usually a 3-year study or even a 1-year study that usually you begin restoration with. So I think there's so many sources that you could keep looking into, and you're bound to find something about your site. And Jason made me study Kahalu'u. On my first day of work at KS, he was like, "You should study this." And I was like, "Oh, I don't know, like whatever, maybe." And then 5 years later, here we are. It's an awesome site, and I am connected to it beyond anything. I moved to Kona for this site. Anybody else? Oh, Clay.
Yeah, you mentioned granted endangered species kind of at the beginning, and sort of hinting at some of the advantages this might have. I'm just curious about kind of 2 parts of it, like the opportunities you see to connect folks to some of these species that they may have never heard of, and probably very rarely get a chance to see. Kind of inaccessible, but also on the same hand, like the potential conflict where you might kind of
Yeah, I think people are really interested in natives, and even more so when they've never seen them before, because it's a rarity. And like in our site, this is just a schematic, but we have the higher Mauka areas, or the Mauka border is actually a forest reserve. So there's more natives or more influence of natives in that upper area. So we actually have that area probably going to be fenced off for protection from pigs, and that's where the more rare species would likely go. And then more on the Makai part, where it's more accessible by trail for education groups and kupuna and kids, that's where we have our more intensive crops. But we're really planting whatever we can get, and people bring things as well. But I think from the education groups that we've been hosting, people are just as interested in the native plant side and the forest side as they are with agriculture and crops. Yeah. Did that answer your question?
Couple more questions.
Aloha.
Well, first, Hōʻuluʻulu.
Mahalo.
Super impressive. I think it's 3 dissertations.
Thanks. You hear that, committee?
So technically, I wanted to go back actually around the food production and the value of the meal. And so one of the things that we're looking at as the Office of Point Affairs, and we're absolutely going to apply and translate some of your findings and your recommendations into policies that we introduce in the state, I think, to really address some of these issues systemically. But I think one of the things we want to understand more around the carrying capacity is how can we look at the quality of the caloric intake too. So looking at the Walla, for example, it's a much higher quality of complex carbohydrate, and so we can, I think, it seems like we could put in additional layers of consideration that not only feed, but actually nourish a healthier Hawaiʻi and Kanapaʻau.
Totally. I think that should be the next dissertation. Someone should really look at, and you have someone, right, the health benefits of, and this comes up over and over, like I haven't even scratched the surface of the health benefits from these systems. And I also today was thinking about the health benefits of exercising through restoration, and just, and you know, there's just so much we could learn more about how the foods traditionally, and it's really, our models are really just a broad sweep right now, but someone could definitely delve deeper and maybe find more information about how we can complement maybe what we're not getting from our foods today. Thank you. Oh. Oh, Aurora.
What parameter causes most of that error? You know, what needs to get, more honed in on to provide a more accurate estimate?
Yeah, unfortunately, because this is based on like average yield per acre, it doesn't really look into like annual fluctuations of weather or spoilage or the variation in yield per acre as well. So I wasn't able to really look at the error, and we qualified it in my previous study that it isn't taking into account like the protein from the ocean and on land, but it's also not taking into account like food that could spoil and food that's lost to weather damage and things like that. So I don't know, I don't have like an uncertainty estimate on it, and I'm not sure how I would do that, but I think it could be done through more empirical testing on the ground. I think that's really the next step for a lot of this, because we don't really even have production estimates for many of these crops in Hawaii. So it's really just average and estimates for now. Thank you. You can do it. Aurora? Okay.
Which would consist of a lot of acres and here has a lot of
Because a lot of people are in private land ownership, and kind of labor trade-offs, especially in rural communities where you have people who need to work jobs to pay bills. And so the labor subsidy that you would require in some cases is really sometimes difficult to figure out. I'm speaking for personal.
Me too. I got you.
So how, if this is awesome vision,
Yeah.
how we kind of overcome this sort of labor access and in some cases water trade-offs. Challenges that are real, and that kind of, I think, if we can figure those out, it would open up, it would unlock a lot more. I'm just curious to think about.
Yeah, that's a good question. Yeah, I think what we provide is really like the baseline for what could be done and provide some of the first studies of these things. But I agree, access is a huge thing and labor is a huge thing. Like doing a Ph.D. and working at Hōʻuluʻulu has been a struggle. But I think some of the things I think about in my new position, I think about funding communities to manage their resources and just trusting people who know those places or maybe ancestrally tied for those places and have them access those sites, have them organize their community around these sites, and have them have these Aina-based education groups come through and begin that relationship. But yeah, I think on the labor side, it is really hard to, I think, you know, a way is to subsidize. Like we obviously have shown that there's cultural benefits, health benefits, there's so many benefits that are not outside of the realm of economics. And often, you know, like people need money. And if we could subsidize some of these programs to provide such greater ecosystem services across and wider across the community, then maybe if some landowners would invest in that, then I think maybe that could be a potential tool. I'm sure someone here has probably a better idea than that. But yeah, we could talk more. We should get beer, like everybody's invited to beers too afterwards.
I think we'll close now. Thanks, Natalie, once again.
They are. Beer Works, Honolulu Beer Works, I don't know, like 5 or 4. We'll be there. Thanks for coming. I don't feel like it. Okay, you're coming to beers, right?
I have to actually, oddly enough, I have to get the lo'i from 4:30 to about 6:30.
Okay.
But after,
Maybe after, yeah, text me. Oh, thanks, Koa. Dang.
Congrats.
I did the forest? No, just kidding.
That's from
So
Samoa.
nice. Oh, it's that. Oh, it's the Cook Island one. Okay. Thank you, Rico. Oh, sweet. Great job. Thank you. Oh, wow. That's beautiful, Pia. Thank you. Sorry I went long.
Oh no.
Great job. I want to see Frankie. Come to beers.
Great job.
Oh, thank you, Jason. That's really nice.
I'll buy beers. This is
Yeah.
sweet.
Yeah, come walk by beers. But I want to see babies. Bring your babies.
Bring the babies
Can you bring babies to bars? Is that weird?
We have.
Okay. Yeah, I'm excited to see you, Jason.
1, 2, 3.
Thank you, Pia. Oh. Did it work? Oh, thank you. I don't know if it's actually great, but at least it's over.
It was great.
In my human communities.
I did. I liked it twice
I
too.
said it twice. But actually, I don't think there's very many. Did you make this?
I did.
Oh, thank you. Sweet.
Good luck with next.
Oh, yeah, thank you. Oh, man.
So awesome.
Thank you, I'm sorry. That's a good question. Now you
It was a
can,
great study.
she can, Jamie's daughter can take it.
Yes.
Beer, you should come for beers too.
Okay, well let me see if somebody can get crew.
Oh, okay. No pressure.
Yeah.
Yeah, I told Jason and Pia to bring theirs to the bar.
Oh,
Bye.
terrific, Natalie. That was excellent.
Thank you so much.
Congratulations.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Oh man.
This is, I made these.
Oh, thanks. Beautiful.
I guess for everybody that's not here.
Thank you. Okay.